Welcome to another episode where I break down a single aphorism. And in this case, it's a passage that I've referenced many times, although I think more often in the first season of the show. It's a passage from The Gay Science. It's in Book 5, Section 354, and it's called The Genius of the Species. I've referenced it a great deal because it's of central importance to understanding Nietzsche's approach to understanding human consciousness and the nature of human thought. And it is probably, all things considered, an underrated passage for the purposes of understanding Nietzsche. It's not one that you hear quoted, just out there in the world among people who aren't super into Nietzsche, like the way that God is dead is quoted. So today we will give this passage one of those among my personal favorites, its due importance, and the honor of giving it a whole episode. So, first, a bit on the background of what we're going to talk about here. The fifth book of The Gay Science was written much later than the rest of the book, most of which, the first four parts of it were written in the early 1880s. I think mostly in 1881, and while Nietzsche is living in Genoa. There's a theme of adventure and exploration, especially in Book 4 of the volume, written during the time, Nietzsche is walking the streets of Genoa and sort of taking in the city, this city of Christopher Columbus, the city of all these brave explorers and merchants, and the city of ancient regal architecture, which sort of like displayed the vulgar wealth and the luxury of the Genovese. And so he often writes of... during this time, he employs the metaphor of sailing across dangerous waters. He uses that as a sort of metaphor for philosophy, seeking out new continents, discovering new worlds, right? And thereby upturning the entire established world of thought that existed beforehand. And in the course of The Gay Science, the bulk of the work that was written in the early 1880s, we get the scene of the madman who declares God is dead, and we actually have the first appearance of Zarathustra at the end of that volume, and we also have the first appearance of eternal recurrence. And so, The Gay Science, the part that was written in the 1880s is in many senses the beginning of the blossoming of a lot of the ideas that Nietzsche is most famous for. It has some of his most exuberant and forward-facing aphorisms. It has one of the most joyous tones out of Nietzsche's work, and it contains all the foundations of his mature philosophy, what's typically called his mature philosophy. The fifth book, meanwhile, entitled We Fearless Ones, is written in 1887. And so this is around the time when Nietzsche completes Genealogy of Morality, one of his more famous books, and itself was called by Nietzsche a sort of footnote on Beyond Good and Evil. And then furthermore, when Nietzsche talks about Beyond Good and Evil, he says it's simply a different presentation of the ideas that he wrote about and thus spoke Zarathustra. And so, all in all, Nietzsche conceives that Thus Spoke Zarathustra was sort of this new era in his work. That's what we mean, and what Nietzsche, I think, understood as his mature philosophy. And everything he writes is sort of an elaboration on these same ideas. And so during this time in 1887, now that he feels his new footing in philosophy has been thoroughly established, then he looks back on some of the material pre-Zarathustra, and sadly enough, he seems to have regretted some of the content of that work, that body of work, what we might call early Nietzsche or experimental Nietzsche, including the Free Spirit period, which is one of my favorite periods of Nietzsche's writing. And he wanted to pull those books from circulation and destroy them, but realizing that this was not possible, he wrote new prefaces to a lot of his early work. And in the case of The Gay Science, because I think he saw that The Gay Science was already, in many respects, The Gay Science is the bridge between early Nietzsche and mature period Nietzsche. It's part of why I think it's not as clean of a delineation between eras, because you can see a resemblance to both eras of Nietzsche's thought contained in this one work. I think there's more continuity between them than some people suggest. But that being said, that's why I think he doesn't with Human All Too Human, he sort of introduces a preface where he kind of contextualizes the whole work as a manifestation of his own convalescence, his recovery from like a long illness, right? In this case, from the illness of Wagnerianism. And so he's going through a phase. He's sort of trying to, if not disavow it, contextualize it, as I said, as not being his full expression of his philosophy. With the Gay Science, interestingly, he writes the entire fifth book to it, right? And so I think he was not wanting to distance himself from the Gay Science quite as much. In fact, he wants to add on and include sort of the more fully developed positions and ideas that he's been cultivating all this time at the end of the work. And so strangely enough, to me, even though there's this great distance, it does not feel entirely out of place. Book 5 does not feel entirely out of place for the rest of the work. And there's some useful clarifications of the ideas earlier in the book. So, for example, the madman passage is effectively clarified by the passage, what our cheerfulness signifies, right? Which appears right at the beginning of the work. So he'd introduced the God is dead idea in the first part of the work, perhaps what would you say, more dramatic and symbolic and ambiguous terms, given it a sort of terrifying gravity in the mouth of the madman. But in the tone of the mature Nietzsche, he more straightforwardly elaborates and simply says, God is dead, and this is both a danger and an opportunity for us free spirits, for the philosophers of the future, right? And so similarly, we might say throughout the work, throughout the first 4 books, there's this idea of the herd morality, or the mentality of the herd animal, right? As it exists within the majority of mankind. The refrain of the book involves Nietzsche looking beneath our social conventions or beneath a given moral idea or a proposition that we've set up as that might be widely believed to be an absolute or trans-historical truth. And then he finds beneath all of these ideas that they're actually socially and historically contingent. They're often created by the use of force, in fact, and through cruelty, outright cruelty. As he says, all great things in humanity's history have been thoroughly soaked in blood. So the behavior of the majority of human beings is not explicable through morality or some higher divine calling or like an absolute morality, but rather by the fact that the social order has used force to mold human beings into creatures which act in accord with the values of the community, right? It has beaten down and crushed the excessively individualistic people. It's ground down all those who wish to challenge the social order or who behave in an evil manner. People who follow values deviant to the community, considered deviant. That is to say, values which diverge from that which provides safety and benefit to the many. And what it means to say that this is done by force is, quite simply that the community's power to punish is what drove the incentive to behave morally. And so what does that mean? It means that even our own internal and even intuitive ideas of what is right or what is wrong, which we often experience as a feeling, right? This feeling occurs because of the long epochs of civilization in which antisocial behavior was met with violence, or with torture, or with executions, or, in more exquisite cases of community cruelty, torture executions, very popular in the old days, popular with everyone from the Assyrians, who just did that kind of thing for a geopolitical tool to stamp out any possibility of opposition, all the way to the medieval Christians who believed they were somehow, liberating the criminal from his own sinfulness by inflicting pain. So in any case, Nietzsche's view of man is that we're ruled by unconscious drives. And so this is a term for impulses, instincts, passions, whatever you want to call them. And your motivations are based on reasons which are physiological, emotional, or otherwise non-rational. And in nature, the typical and usually inexorable reality is that every impulse which demands fulfillment is immediately fulfilled, or at least attempted to be fulfilled by the organism. If a deer feels fear, it flees without really thinking of the matter or by giving it what we humans would call a second thought, right? My friend Andrei Georgescu, in a recent podcast of his, talked about predatory felines. and their known capacity for what is called pleasurable killing, wherein the animal simply kills for the fun of it. And so he gives an example where a species of leopard, I believe it was observed or documented killing like over 20 sheep in a single go. And obviously can't eat all the sheep that it kills if it kills such a large number. I mean, typically a big cat will grab one prey animal and carry it off, right? So why kill 20 of them? And the reason for this is simple. The cat has an impulse to kill any prey that it detects, which the cat determines is easy to take down and like ready at hand, right? I forget exactly what the pre-rescues, but the act of hunting, it begins as a utilitarian pursuit of an organism, but over time, because you need to eat to survive, obviously, right? But over time, all of the activities or behaviors which an organism does, and the ones which produce the same result every time, begin to, if they're beneficial, right, they generate a sense of pleasure all on their own, because this is how the instincts or the drives reinforce themselves. And so for the leopard, or any predatory species really, it's a pleasure to hunt down and kill prey. It's an impulse that wishes to be satisfied, which takes on a life of its own quite independently from the impulse of hunger or to acquire food. It's killing for the pleasure of killing, which presents an uncomfortable reality within nature that one must confront, which was I think the broader point of Andre's podcast episode, at least to some extent. But for our purposes here, I bring it up to consider the way in which a feeling, a pleasurable feeling, comes to be sought out by an organism independently of the ends which that impulse originally served. And so could we think of any of these with human beings? I mean, the obvious drive to consider first is the sex drive. I mean, humans obviously feel pleasure and want sex independently of their drive to reproduce and have children. And so the reason why the sexual impulse feels good to fulfill, it originates because it has to feel that way in order to motivate the evolutionarily beneficial behavior of sexual reproduction. And yet, like with the predatory cat, enjoying the pleasure of killing, even when it doesn't bring any additional food, even when the cat does not need additional food, we humans have been primed to enjoy sex and seek out sex completely for the sake of the pleasure that it brings. And so you have long eons of evolution reinforcing the impulse. And so if the impulses wish to be fulfilled immediately, or at least we might say a sufficiently strong impulse may tug at the consciousness and demand its attention, and demand that the subject at least begin working towards fulfilling the impulse, what is it about civilization that can counter the power of impulse to pull us or push us in one direction or another? And for Nietzsche, it's the feeling of fear. That's what the community has, fear of the community's power. Now, this is, in Nietzsche's view, one of the factors that motivated human beings to be able to think rationally at all. It's what developed our powers of thought. Why? Because the community's power to punish is something that will happen off in the future. If one transgresses as the morality of the community, or according to the morality of the community, then we face their wrath. And so in modern times, the police, if one breaks the law, or like let's take actually a moral transgression that doesn't warrant legal punishment, like in modern times, such as adultery. What's required in order to feel this fear is the ability to imagine the potential future in which the wrath of the community is visited upon us. So we must be able to somehow counter a feeling with a thought. We must be able to say no to an impulse, tell the impulse to wait, or to suppress itself entirely because of the fear of what might happen in the future. And this is, in Nietzsche's estimation, the entire impotence for the expansion of human consciousness and self-reflection because of this temporal awareness, this ability for knowledge which reaches into the future and conceives of a future self. That's the prerequisite for self-awareness, the idea that there is an identity which is coherent across time, which we inhabit, that there is a me which exists in the past, present, and future, and that same me which exists now will be punished or perhaps even destroyed if I cannot control myself. And in talking about this in his unpublished notes, this is one from 1874, I've brought it before, Nietzsche uses the example of the unchaste woman and, what motivates her to, just again, that the idea that a feeling must be suppressed by a thought. So it's through fear indirectly, and thus, in a sense, through force, it's coercion, right, that we get the perception of time, the self-awareness of consciousness, the ability to behave morally, or to speak more directly, to act in accord with the legal and moral demands of society. And so the very existence of consciousness is yet another great thing, which is, as Nietzsche says, soaked in blood. It's paid for, by millennia, tens or hundreds of millennia of communities enforcing their collective will based on their own collective self-interest upon the constituent individuals, shaping them into conscious beings which have an idea of what they are, such that they can promise and be held accountable, so that they can remember things and imagine future events. And so, if this is the nature of consciousness and the origin of human thought, where does this leave individualism? And a theme throughout the gay science is the theme of individualism that you could read into it. I mean, really what Nietzsche talks about a lot is the higher man, or the noble individual who is not simply yet another one of the herd, but who still possesses some chaos within them, or a capacity for evil, or an intellect which allows him to question the herd's morality and to see through it. And so on many levels, Nietzsche thinks these types of people are born and not made, because in many cases the higher man is simply someone whose conscience may not be as forceful or not as keyed in to the voice of the community. And that's what the conscience is, by the way. The internal moral guide which we possess is the voice of the community in our heads, which cajoles us with good feelings when we behave in accord with the conventional morality, with what we imagine others would say if they could judge us on our actions, right? And it prods us with bad feelings when we transgress, with guilt, which again, that's our imagination of what others would think of our actions. It's really a more sophisticated form of the fear of the community that transgression against the community brings. And so one of Nietzsche's theories is that, what you might call the higher man, the morally wicked individualist who doesn't conform to the herd morality, that's just simply someone with instincts which override their conscience, or perhaps his conscience is actually weaker. It simply speaks to him differently than it speaks to other men. And so, and we should say, it's always the philosopher who must be the wicked conscience of his age, as Nietzsche puts it in Nietzsche contra Wagner. And so Nietzsche feels that as a truly skeptical and anti-metaphysical philosopher, he can, in the gay science, attack these prejudices about our conscience, about our own internal moral voice, and become an advocate for the wicked higher man, right? As those individuals who, as he says in the very beginning of the book, improve the species just as much as the good person, just albeit in a different way. And so, as I said earlier, the first 4 books of the gay science are written when these ideas are relatively new and fresh. But in the time between the end of book 4 and when Nietzsche returns in 1887 with book 5, he's more powerfully developed his understanding of morality and of the human condition and of the psychological history of mankind. And this is, the same year he's written Genealogy of Morality, which is where I think that inherent opposition that he sees into humanity comes into full resolution. What is Dionysian versus what is Christian? And so Nietzsche develops the idea of the original good of mankind having been a physical good. Good was your power to act in the world, in physical reality, to overcome obstacles in physical reality, defeat enemies in physical combat. The good man was the powerful man in this sense, whereas the weak person was the one who was contemptible, who could not repay his enemies in kind or give generously to his friends. This person was looked on not as evil, but as I said, just simply shameful or contemptible. And so that's the master morality of old, the noble ideology of the pagan Greeks, wherein one begins from the confidence to legislate values themselves and to live in a healthy accord with their own passions. Christianity, when it arises, in addition to all the other criticism Nietzsche heaps on Christianity, such as the obsession with pity or the love of suffering and martyrdom, Christianity in contrast makes the good into something abstract. The ultimate good is heaven, which is something which is imagined while we're here on earth. Good is the negation of the world, the rejection of physical reality. It's in so Nietzsche's estimation, it's weak individuals and weak cultures who must do things like imagine revenge against their enemies in a terrible afterlife, or redefine goodness as harmlessness, or redefine it as the ability to suffer with equanimity, right? The good as an abstract thing becomes untethered from the physical good, and in fact Christianity eventually becomes hostile to the physical, hostile to the body, to the world, to physical desires. And so, while it's not true in my opinion that Nietzsche is an irrationalist or that he's anti-philosophy or anti-intellectual, I mean, for various reasons, including the fact that he considered this very critique and assessment of where our consciousness comes from to be a philosophical endeavor, nevertheless, he ultimately comes to a position in his later career which treats things like the intellect and abstract philosophy as, in some sense, dangerous. The conscious intellect, shaped and molded as it has been by the weakness and herdishness of the collective morality, cannot really be trusted. And for Nietzsche, the abstract good looks like pale in comparison to the physical good, right? To the extent that our endeavors in the world enter into the world of abstract concepts or philosophizing or spiritual pursuits, we drift from the embodied good and we risk valuing things which are actually harmful to life in the physiological sense. And so that's why Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist that perhaps the most dangerous thing is to untether the intellect from the instincts. Or he says that the ways that the intellect can go wrong, because the instincts can go wrong too, right? Obviously, but the ways the intellect can go wrong can be far more dangerous because it's only on the grounding of the instincts that we can, in some sense, check the intellect's excesses. Without this grounding, it can come up with all sorts of values or ideas, which, if they don't have to be checked against physical reality, can be totally harmful to life. And so, in some sense, Nietzsche just, you could summarize it as saying you should treat all your abstract intellectualism as suspect. But so then now we come to the appearance of the passage in Book 5, which clarifies many of ideas about consciousness, as I've said, and makes clear the problems of consciousness in the Nietzschean sense and the inherent link of consciousness to the herd mentality. And it's uncomfortable, I think, this passage for many, because it means that even the most dire Nietzschean individualist will have to admit, if he wishes to be fully Nietzschean, that even consciousness itself has, as a prerequisite, the influence of the herd upon the individual, meaning that none of us are free from this. And thus, as you may have guessed, the Gay Science 354, Genius of the Species, it's a passage about the nature of consciousness itself as a social phenomenon, and it's also heavily involved with language and the link between linguistic concepts and a shared collective reality. It's a passage many have compared to Wittgenstein and have suggested anticipated Wittgenstein, or even the entire linguistic turn in philosophy. You could read this passage as a different phrasing of the idea that there's no such thing as a private language. At least in some part, that's what Nietzsche argues at the beginning of it. And so he gives us, Nietzsche does, a description of the conceptual world which is communal. And it has huge implications for his whole philosophy. So I'll read the passage in its entirety, and boy, is it a long one, but I think this is the best way to do it. I'll read the entire passage from start to finish, and then we'll go back paragraph by paragraph or chunk by chunk and look at the assertions within the passage more in depth. And so, without further ado, The Gay Science, Book 5, aphorism 354, quote, "On the genius of the species. The problem of consciousness, more precisely of becoming conscious of something, confronts us only when we begin to comprehend how we could dispense with it. And now, physiology and the history of animals place us at the beginning of such comprehension. It took them 2 centuries to catch up with Leibniz's suspicion which soared ahead. For we could think, feel, will, and remember, and we could also act in every sense of the word, and yet none of all this would have to enter our consciousness, as one says metaphorically. The whole of life would be possible without, as it were, seeing itself in a mirror. Even now, for that matter, by far the greatest portion of our life actually takes place without this mirror effect, and this is true even of our thinking, feeling, and willing life, however offensive this may sound to older philosophers. For what purpose, then, any consciousness at all, when it is, in the main, superfluous? Now, if you are willing to listen to my answer, and perhaps extravagant surmise that it involves, it seems to me as if the subtlety and strength of consciousness always were proportionate to a man's or animal's capacity for communication, and as if this capacity in turn were proportionate to the need for communication. But this last point is not to be understood as if the individual human being who happens to be a master in communicating and making understandable his needs must also be the most dependent on others in his needs. But it does seem to me as if it were that way when we consider whole races and chains of generations, where need and distress have forced men for a long time to communicate and to understand each other quickly and subtly. The ultimate result is an excess of this strength and art of communication, as it were, a capacity that has gradually accumulated and now waits for an heir who might squander it. Those who are called artists are these heirs. So are orators, preachers, writers, all of them people who always come at the end of a long chain, late born, every one of them in the best sense of that word, and as I have said, by their nature, squanderers. Supposing this observation is correct, I may now proceed to the surmise that consciousness has developed only under the pressure of the need for communication, that from the start it was needed and useful only between human beings, particularly those who commanded and those who obeyed, and that it also developed only in proportion to the degree of this utility. Consciousness is really only a net of communication between human beings. It is only as such that it had to develop. A solitary human being who lived like a beast of prey would not have needed it. That our actions, thoughts, feelings, and movements enter into our consciousness, at least a part of them, that is the result of a must that for a terribly long time lorded it over man. As the most endangered animal, he needed help and protection. He needed his peers. He had to learn to express his distress and to make himself understood, and for all of this he needed consciousness. First of all, he needed to know himself what distressed him. He needed to know how he felt. He needed to know what he thought. For, to say it once more, man, like every living being, thinks continually without knowing it. The thinking that rises to consciousness is only the smallest part of all this, the most superficial and worst part. For only this conscious thinking takes the form of words, which is to say, signs of communication. And this fact uncovers the origins of consciousness. Add to this that not only language serves as a bridge between human beings, but also a mean, a pressure, a gesture. The emergence of our sense impressions into our consciousness, the ability to fix them and, as it were, exhibit them externally, increased proportionately with the need to communicate them to others by means of signs. The human being inventing signs is at the same time the human being who becomes ever more keenly conscious of himself. It was only as a social animal that man acquired self-consciousness, which he is still in the process of doing more and more. My idea is, as you see, that consciousness does not really belong to man's individual existence, but rather to his social or herd nature. That, as follows from this, it has developed subtly insofar as this is required by social or herd utility. Consequently, given the best will in the world to understand ourselves as individually as possible, to know ourselves, each of us will always succeed in becoming conscious only of what is not individual but average. Our thoughts themselves are continually governed by the character of consciousness, by the genius of the species that commands it, and translated back into the perspective of the herd. Fundamentally, all our actions are altogether incomparably personal, unique, and infinitely individual. There is no doubt of that. But as soon as we translate them into consciousness, they no longer seem to be. This is the essence of phenomenalism and perspectivism as I understand them. Owing to the nature of animal consciousness, the world of which we can become conscious is only a surface and sign world, a world that is made common and meaner. Whatever becomes conscious becomes, by the same token, shallow, thin, relatively stupid, general, sign, herd signal. All becoming conscious involves a great and thorough corruption, falsification, reduction to superficialities, and generalization. Ultimately, the growth of consciousness becomes a danger, and anyone who lives among the most conscious Europeans even knows that it is a disease. You will guess that it is not the opposition of subject and object that concerns me here. This distinction I leave to the epistemologists, who have become entangled in the snares of grammar, the metaphysics of the people. It is even less the opposition of thing in itself and appearance, for we do not know nearly enough to be entitled to such a distinction. We simply lack any organ for knowledge, for truth. We know, or believe, or imagine just as much as may be useful in the interests of the human herd, the species. And even what is here called utility is ultimately also a mere belief, something imaginary, and perhaps precisely the most calamitous stupidity of which we shall perish one day. End quote. So now, after having read that entire thing, which sets my mind swimming in all sorts of directions every time I hear it, which I hope you've had the same experience, now let's go back and take it piece by piece, and I will interject wherever I have notes. It's not like a sentence. I'm not going to do sentence by sentence, sort of like chunk by chunk, right? Okay. Quote, on the genius of the species, the problem of consciousness, more precisely of becoming conscious of something, confronts us only when we begin to comprehend how we could dispense with it. And now physiology and the history of animals place us at the beginning of such comprehension. It took them 2 centuries to catch up with Leibniz's suspicion, which soared ahead. End quote. So the study of history and the knowledge we now possess about the physiology of animals now places us where? At the comprehension that consciousness is a thing that could be dispensed with, that it's not necessary for life. Now that we know so much about the physiology of the animal world and about evolution, the history of life, and even the history of human life, it would just seem to reveal to us, especially in terms of our deep history, what we would call anthropology today, we know that humanity struggled forward from a sort of semi-conscious state into the state of self-reflectiveness that we know today. And indeed, the first life forms must have been entirely without consciousness, for it's an evolved trait. And like every evolved trait, it's something that emerges from selection pressures, from historical circumstances which arose, from past needs, past problems, so on. And so once we gain the knowledge that consciousness could be dispensed with, or that life can exist without it, as Nietzsche says, we can then begin to seriously ask the question of why it might arise, what benefit it brought then, and what benefit it brings now. And so as for the remark on Leibniz, he's one of the first, if not the first, to suggest that we might have perceptions of which we are not consciously aware. In other words, that perception is possible without a fully reflective self-consciousness. So that's why Nietzsche says Leibniz soared ahead of everyone else in suspecting this. Okay, quote, for we could think, feel, will, and remember, and we could also act in every sense of the word, and yet none of all this would have to enter our consciousness, as one says metaphorically. The whole of life would be possible without, as it were, seeing itself in a mirror. Even now, for that matter, by far, the greatest portion of our life actually takes place without this mirror effect, and this is true even of our thinking, feeling, and willing life, however offensive this may sound to older philosophers. For what purpose, then, any consciousness at all when it is, in the main, superfluous? End quote. So this part of the passage begins in a way that it's self-explanatory, I think, or it's explanatory of the point I was just making, that consciousness is simply a mirror that the self holds up to perceive itself. I like the mirror metaphor. It implies a sense of pointlessness or idleness or vanity, right? That consciousness isn't doing any work for us. It's not a tool that is apparently really something productive, right? But he counters the rebuttal that consciousness is what allows us to think or to feel or to will. He argues that it doesn't. His proof of this is perhaps the more important part of the passage, something which he explains in great detail in Beyond Good and Evil, that the greater part of our intellectual life is even hidden from us. or is not brought into conscious reflection, that we are strangers to ourselves, that our motivations are not always clear to ourselves, that sometimes the consciousness may even cover up or lie about what our true motivations are, and we may deny it to ourselves when we feel a certain way that we're not supposed to feel. And so perhaps there's a whole world of perceptions and judgments that we're making under the surface, and only the tip of the iceberg ever becomes conscious to us. And so this is Nietzsche's philosophy of the unconscious. It's the beginning of psychoanalysis, right? But all of this that he said so far is just a backdrop for the most important question that Nietzsche then raises. Supposing consciousness then is superfluous, it's a superficial skin, as he calls it elsewhere, a self-reflective mirror that we hold up, but is not necessary for the functioning of the organism. So for what purpose does it exist? Same question. So, quote, "Now, if you're willing to listen to my answer and perhaps extravagant surmise that it involves, it seems to me as if the subtlety and strength of consciousness were always proportionate to a man's or animal's capacity for communication, and as if this capacity in turn were proportionate to the need for communication," end quote. So this refines what we're talking about. We've looked at consciousness as to how it aids the individual organism in surviving, reproducing, becoming fit, becoming successful. In that respect, he sees no advantage given here. But if we look at what consciousness enables us to do on the collective level, it becomes very clear and hints to us the origin of consciousness and why it may have arisen. It allows us to communicate. And so this doesn't improve the fitness of the individual in any way, which is readily apparent. If an individual has a need to communicate, though, this would drive the development of something approaching consciousness. So why would there be a need to communicate? And so here Nietzsche is going far beyond anticipating Wittgenstein or the philosophers of language by suggesting that consciousness itself is a result of the need for communication. He's predating the work of, for example, Eric Gans or William von Hippel. Peter Turchin's talked about this in his work, and many others, who have suggested that it's actually the power of sociality that drove the need for consciousness, right? Human sociality requires communication. Communication requires consciousness, which means that communication is, in some sense, premised on, among other things, theory of mind, an understanding that you know things which I don't know, or I know things which you don't know. So that's a dividing line between humans and other apes, or other primates, rather. So a lot of other primates are sentient to some degree, but they don't really have the same understanding of theory of mind that we do. They have something approximating it, but they don't have it fully enough to communicate to the degree that human beings do. And so the reason is that human beings, upon becoming social animals, we use this advantage to absolutely dominate as a predator species, even against species which are physically more powerful than humans on the one-to-one level, on the individual level. A human being on a one-to-one comparison with a lion, the lion wins every time. In William von Hippel's work, he talks about the reason why the numerical advantage for humans became so much more powerful for us than other species is because we have these limbs that are such that we can throw projectiles, and working together throwing projectiles is a very powerful strategy one can use in nature. There's a passage from his book I'll just quote really quickly. Quote, "If you drop one of us naked and alone into the wilderness, you've just fed the creatures of the local forest. But if you drop 100 of us naked into the wilderness, you've introduced a new top predator to this unfortunate stretch of woods," end quote. So I think that sums it up pretty well without having to go into more about, anthropology. But you can probably get it on an intuitive level. The real advantage of consciousness, in an evolutionary sense, is the power that comes with coordination, i.e. communication. The innovation and the teamwork that simply was not possible for other predatory species. So moving on with the passage, quote, But this last point is not to be understood as if the individual being who happens to be a master in communicating and making understandable his needs must also be most dependent on others in his needs. But it does seem to me, as it were, that way when we consider whole races and chains of generations, where need and distress have forced men for a long time to communicate, to understand each other quickly and subtly, the ultimate result is an excess of the strength and art of communication, as it were, a capacity that is gradually accumulated and now waits for an heir who might squander it. And those who are called artists are these heirs, so are orators, preachers, and writers. And end quote. I'm just bridge the rest of that parenthetical remark here. Okay, so there's 2 points in this sort of 2 components in this piece of the text we're looking at. So for one, Nietzsche reinforces the point that this is something gradually stored up, the ability for communication. And as an aside, when he wishes for an heir to come and squander it, he thinks that's a good thing, right? Squandering is the proper use for riches to Nietzsche. It's good to destroy your excess wealth. And so he's suggesting that the use of language, now as strongly as refined as it is, it can be employed for uses that have nothing to do with survival or the original quotidian needs that communication, like linguistic communication fulfilled. It's gone beyond that now. But the other component of this, I think, is the de-emphasis on the individual talent for communication as having to do with what he's talking here. He's not talking about, over what a lifetime of need and distress, those people will be the best communicators, right? He's saying, I'm not saying this is predictive on the individual level. He's takes the time to say, I'm talking about long generations. This is about the entire species, entire populations. Okay, continuing on. Quote, supposing this observation is correct, I may now proceed to the surmise that consciousness has developed only under pressure of the need for communication, that from the start it was needed and useful only between human beings, particularly between those who commanded and those who obeyed, and that it also developed only in proportion to the degree of this utility. End quote. And so this is where Nietzsche smashes the possibility of a cuddly communitarian understanding of what he's saying here, since he ties the need for communication directly to commanding and obeying. Now, and there's truth to this, because we have to look at what I just spoke of, the advantage of communication in bringing, the ability to coordinate, right? You have to talk about what that means in practical terms. How did that actually play out in human history, right? So communication isn't useful just because it creates some sort of equal communion of souls where people can form voluntary associations or whatever. I mean, certainly that's possible, but that isn't the power that communication gave us. The power is being able to tell other people what to do. I phrase it that way very bluntly for a reason, because I want to be straightforward about the ends that you're trying to get to when you communicate, or when you communicate in such a way as to produce cooperation that changes the external world, that does something, that accomplishes something in the world, using collective power to do that. What does that look like? And this needn't be understood as just like a brutish understanding of mankind, right? Even if you have some organization of human beings, some tribe or hunting party in the Neolithic days, for example, that doesn't mean the leader has to be a selfish, stupid brute who bosses others around. That's not what I'm saying. What it does mean is that communication attains its usefulness when it is instrumental in helping others to understand in what way they must subordinate their individual will to the greater project of the group. That's what collective power looks like. And so there's a serious argument to be made that what organizing human beings or what cooperation looks like is always hierarchy, that any effective organization will involve the subordination of members according to rank, with most of the decision-making power at the top, right? Because making spontaneous decisions, if everyone's making their own individual spontaneous voluntary decisions all the time, you're not coordinating, right? So it has to be to some extent, there has to be a minority of decision makers and majority followers. The reason I'm belaboring this point now is that one could easily read everything in this passage up to this point and think Nietzsche was talking about primitive communism or something like that. He's really not. And I think historically that he probably is correct, that the entire reason why such hierarchical social structures emerged during the time of the earliest empires is because they emerged out of militaries, right? The way a military is organized is hierarchical. The first seeds of what would later become states. So, you have in the course of human history initially actually rather communitarian or egalitarian small tribal groups. But then as the human capacity for warfare or for organized collective violence increases, you have to have tribal confederations, and those aggregate into bigger and bigger associations, and then you have a certain inflection point where then you get empires, where you're ruling over multiple groups of people with one state, right? And so when human beings organized themselves en masse into military formations and used military organization to attack their enemies, they did it on the basis of an order of rank, right? And militaries still operate that way today, even if they exist within the framework of a democratic society. We still recognize, and militaries today still assert, it's essential that they be able to maintain their chain of command. The military can never function if everyone is using their communication abilities, for example, for self-expression or to constantly argue for what they think the best strategy is. That just doesn't work in actuality. Okay, so then Nietzsche goes further, and he makes what's perhaps the most dynamite claim in the whole passage. Quote, "Consciousness is really only a net of communication between human beings. It is only as such that it had to develop. A solitary human being who lived like a beast of prey would not have needed it." End quote. I mean, right there you have, you want to talk Nietzsche anticipating Wittgenstein. If a lion could speak, we would not understand him. Nietzsche, by implication, just said that here. He didn't even have to say it directly. And so from this supposition that Nietzsche then expands on, the idea that communication and consciousness are in some sense not just related to one another, but the same thing. That the fact that we're conscious at all is so intimately bound up with the need and impulse to communicate that it's like the entire function of the consciousness. And that without communication, consciousness, it would seem to be an entirely odd, out of place, and disposable thing. And in fact, consciousness in absentia of any other soul to communicate with is a kind of hell. That's what solitary confinement is, for example. And then on the other hand, communication is almost impossible, to conceive of without consciousness. And here I mean true communication, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with Searle's Chinese room experiment, right? Or thought experiment. That I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about true communication. And so what are the implications of this? Nietzsche goes on, quote, that our actions, thoughts, feelings, and movements enter our own consciousness, at least a part of them. That is the result of a must that held for a terribly long time, lorded it over man. As the most endangered animal, he needed help and protection. He needed his peers. He had to learn to express his distress and to make himself understood. And for all of this, he needed consciousness. First of all, he needed to know himself what distressed him. He needed to know how he felt. He needed to know what he thought. For to say it once more, man, like every living being, thinks continually without knowing it. The thinking that rises to consciousness is only the smallest part of all this, the most superficial and worst part, for only this conscious thinking takes the form of words, which is to say, signs of communication. And this fact uncovers the origins of consciousness. End quote. And so the account for Nietzsche, the account that he gives of how we became conscious, needing to express our distress, for example, I think is a bit less than accurate, I'll say politely. It's certainly less on the nose than the great insight that consciousness gives us the power of organization through commanding and obeying, right? I think he's dead on there. But aside from that, if we consider the overall thrust of the passage, he does offer us something valuable here to consider, insofar as the conscious parts of our mind only entered consciousness. Why? Because we had some reason to communicate them. That if we couch all of this within the understanding that the human mind does not exist in a fully conscious form, we didn't suddenly become fully conscious. We also have a rich unconscious life. Then the parts which are conscious are the parts of the mind which felt the need or the pressure, social, selective, or otherwise, to make themselves understood. And so then Nietzsche delivers his form of proof for this argument, that our conscious thought only takes place within words. In fact, we can have feelings and sensations and perceptions and so on, which we cannot put into words, and which are therefore beyond our discourse, beyond our logic or our ability to effectively communicate. And so again, we could call to mind Wittgenstein. He said that what is beyond doubt for us is also beyond certainty, because if a proposition can't be doubted, such as the proposition, I am in pain, then we cannot say that we know it either. We can't say we know it with certainty if we can't say that we have any doubt about it, because we can't subject it to scrutiny. And so this is what is meant by the idea that the thought must take place within language, that which can be said clearly. And so truth, in the sense that we normally think about it, can only sort of be contained in that which is linguistically expressible. Okay, moving on. Quote, in brief, the development of language and the development of consciousness, not of reason, but merely the way reason enters consciousness, go hand in hand. End quote. A brief aside here, reason can exist on an unconscious level, just as perception can exist on an unconscious level. That's because, as Nietzsche argues elsewhere, every impulse, every drive has its own form of reason, which informs our actions. We can only really subject a drive to logical scrutiny when we manage to formulate its propositions into language, which that would certainly be an interesting topic. But Nietzsche's point here is simply to say that reasoning is going on within your body, in your instincts, even if you don't perceive it. Reason is contained in judgments you make and in the valuations you have. I want this. What is the best way to get this? Your hunger impulse has its own form of reason, which your consciousness may occasionally experience, especially if you're on a diet, right? You may even voice words that follow the line of reasoning of not you in a total unitary sense, but simply an impulse. That might even be an impulse you consider to be one of the worst parts of you, right? You may sometimes find yourself thinking the thought process that follows the reason of an impulse that you don't like. And so, but what that means is, in any case, that you've brought the reasons or the impulse's reason into conscious awareness. But that doesn't mean that it isn't going on just because you aren't aware of it. That's really the key point. Okay, so continuing. Quote, add to this that not only language serves as a bridge between human beings, but also a mean, a pressure, a gesture. The emergence of our sense impressions into our consciousness, the ability to fix them and, as it were, exhibit them externally, increased proportionately with the need to communicate them to others by means of signs. The human being inventing signs is at the same time the human being who becomes ever more keenly conscious of himself. It was only as a social animal that man acquired self-consciousness, which he is still in the process of doing more and more. End quote. And so it's not just linguistic symbols or audial symbols strung together in a grammatical structure, which indicate a thought or feeling or something, but also gestures and so on. And so the important thing is it's not just words, but the act of using a symbol, using something to represent something else. That's part of how we become self-conscious. And so there's an implicit criticism or danger that begins to creep up here, for which we might have to consider the early essay on truth and lies in the extramoral sense, which he says that words and the concepts which stand behind them are merely metaphors or anthropomorphisms. In short, the whole character of our self-consciousness is an act of creating being out of becoming. We perceive a world which is in its totality chaotic, dynamic, ever-shifting, where there's no clear boundaries. But in order to communicate about that world, we have to essentialize things. That is, give them an essence, right? Make things stable, coherent, consistent. Invent the idea of duration. That's the function of our consciousness. In other words, to equate unequal things, as Nietzsche says in that essay. And so this is all fine because the function of language was never to seek truth, right? It was to fulfill the need that human beings had for an evolutionary advantage. And as a collective, this strengthened the organism. But as a result of this, now we have all of these linguistic concepts which are formed in our brains and tell us we live in a world of things, which are out there, which are defined as separate from one another, which is to say each word concept is cordoned off within a given definition. In the essay on Truth and Lies, Nietzsche talks about how the Romans, for each god or goddess, divided up a portion of the sky where they said rigidly, the god has his temple on earth where you say this is the holy ground that is owed to this particular god. Like this is the temple of Concord, this is the temple of Saturn, and so on. But they also did it with the heavens and said that confined within these rigid boundaries up there in the sky, that's where this god lives. Particularly, he lives right here. And he doesn't go into the domain of the other gods. Nietzsche, in that essay, says all of our linguistic word concepts are like that. That is what we have done. We've taken thin air, the vast open sky, and all of its mystery and majesty, and just a great example of a thing with absolutely no boundaries, and drawn imaginary boundaries, cordoning it off certain parts of it, and saying this is where this concept belongs. That's incredibly useful for the purposes of communication, which is consciousness's function. But it has absolutely nothing to do with the reality underneath, so to speak. Although I don't want to give the wrong impression at that point, because Nietzsche says he's not talking about the true world, thing in itself world versus a imagined world. He's not saying that at all, because I think Nietzsche would very much affirm the world of sort of perception, of direct perception that we have, that we do have access to. So he's not saying we don't have access to the quote-unquote true world. If the true world is if we abolish both of those worlds and just live in the world of direct perception, that's not the problem he's getting at. He's talking about how we think about the world being falsified, our cognition being an act of falsifying the world. And it's through this process, though, also, I should bring up, that individual self-consciousness is created, by the way. And it's a process which Nietzsche is saying is still occurring. So for all you individualists out there, that's where we get the individual self-consciousness. It emerges out of this faculty which existed for the collective advantage and out of a communal need. So, yeah, very complicated, actually, when you think about some of the things he's saying here. Okay, quote, "My idea is, as you see, that consciousness does not really belong to man's individual existence, but rather to his social or herd nature. That, as follows from this, it has developed subtlety insofar as this is required by social or herd utility. Consequently, given the best will in the world to understand ourselves as individually as possible, to know ourselves, each of us will always succeed in becoming conscious only of what is not individual but average. Our thoughts themselves are continually governed by the character of consciousness, by the genius of the species that commands it, and translated back into the perspective of the herd. Fundamentally, all our actions are altogether incomparably personal, unique, and infinitely individual. There is no doubt of that. But as soon as we translate them into consciousness, they no longer seem to be." End quote. Okay, roll credits. We have a title, The Genius of the Species, right? And what is the genius of the species then? Now, it's the character of consciousness itself, as he says, emerging out of a species-wide collective need, and thus the need of the collective imposes itself even on our private thoughts whenever they're brought into consciousness. And the word genius here can be considered for the etymological connection to the word genie. It's something immaterial, spiritual even. In this case, we might say Nietzsche's understanding would be psychological or socio-psychological. It's a spirit which is with all of us. I mean, here the metaphorical language is actually much better for talking about this. I think it gets it across better. It's a spirit that shapes and patterns all of our thoughts. And so the argument is simple. Language is not private. That's one aspect of this. Language is determined by all the factors we've been discussing: the needs of the herd, the utility of the herd. There's no private language in Wittgenstein's work, nor in this passage here, in which Nietzsche charges that any thought too unique, too independent, too much beyond the pale of the herd's understanding, or the herd's thought patterns, shaped by the herd's needs, that will either remain beyond the scope of conscious thought, or else be forced into a linguistic concept pattern which in some way warps or alters the thought, such that it can't really be comprehended by anyone else. And so perhaps one way of saying this, so, the word tree does not mean what you think is a tree. It means what other people consider to be a tree. And not just some other people. It means what we all consider to be a tree. It's what we all agree on. This is getting into later Wittgenstein, the understanding of language as a tool, which is determined by use. It has no precise, words don't have precise essential meanings which unite all the uses of a word, right? There's merely a familial resemblance of overlapping, similar uses and descriptions of similar situations. And so, whatever exists within the human mind which is outside of all that, or doesn't enter into the shared linguistic concepts which are useful for the many, that becomes inexpressible in some sense. And so, such that all expression which originates from what we might call an individualistic origin remains silent or becomes distorted by the signal. And so this is, if it's not clear enough, this is a criticism of consciousness itself. If you can take seriously the polemics against the herd morality throughout the book, then we can only conclude that this should be regarded as a downside or a flaw in consciousness itself. And since self-consciousness, well, again, it's not the sole domain of reason to Nietzsche, but self-consciousness is the domain of things like philosophy, religion, politics, ethics, and so on. All our philosophizing and our religious thought, that's necessarily saddled with the limitations of consciousness and the binding of our thought patterns into shapes which persist now because of their usefulness for the majority, for the collective, and what is average, as he puts it. And so this is an aspect of why philosophy is decadent in Nietzsche's view. It's the inherently flawed nature of conscious self-reflection that has led to so many errors in philosophy, so much of a misunderstanding by philosophers themselves as to what philosophy is or what it's useful for is also responsible for this. And so much abstract silliness, right? I don't know. It's attempts to relocate value from the physical world. Okay, moving on. Quote, "This is the essence of phenomenalism and perspectivism as I understand them. Owing to the nature of animal consciousness, the world of which we can become conscious is only a surface and sign world, a world that is made common and meaner. Whatever becomes conscious becomes by the same token shallow, thin, relatively stupid, general, sign, herd signal. All becoming conscious involves a great and thorough corruption, falsification, reduction to superficialities, and generalization. Ultimately, the growth of consciousness becomes a danger, and anyone who lives among the most conscious Europeans even knows that it is a disease." End quote. So this is a sort of summary of what Nietzsche said up to this point, but now with a much stronger tone to it. It's very clear now this passage is intended to criticize consciousness, and notice the terminology he uses. It involves a great and thorough corruption. It's the same language he makes synonymous with weakness and decadence in the book The Antichrist. And so this is part of his understanding of power as a monistic principle that governs all life. Life is will to power. And so what is will to power? Will to power is expressed by discharging one's strength, by spending one's power, one's life force to create beyond oneself. And so it's in the nature of all things to eventually, you have your life force, you discharge it, you grow weak, and you go into a decline. Power doesn't last forever. It it's discharged and goes off into a new form. The decline of life is called by Nietzsche decadence, corruption, or weakness. And that is how he's describing consciousness here, a corruption on life, something which on the whole weakens us, because whatever becomes conscious becomes cheapened. It ruins and makes shallow the whole depth and intellectual and spiritual life of man. And yet, I don't know, maybe this would be a disagreement with Nietzsche. I'm not sure exactly how he stands on this, but I think collective power is what sustained us. And well, I mean, I know he knows this, but since it is what sustained us and eventually allowed us to surpass all the other animals, and then it was the group, the human group, right, that could best cooperate, that dominated other human groups, and thus imposed their hierarchy based on their values, meaning that collective power is the determinant in whether some group of human beings succeeds in, discharging their strength, as it were, and satisfying its will to power or not. So you can still fit my opinion, I think, into a Nietzschean framework, because Nietzsche might well say, yes, of course, all that's true, but just as Christianity overthrew the Roman Empire, right, through the mimetic translation or transmission of its ideas, nevertheless, in doing so, it caused corruption to spread throughout Europe, right? Consciousness was a powerful tool, but like all powerful things, it contains within it the seeds of corruption that will one day weaken all those who inherit it, right? And that's what's happening now. So perhaps the key factor to understand here is that Nietzsche I think he's kind of clouded the issue by speaking in biological or physiological terms throughout this passage. But because you can also determine from some of his remarks here that there are differing degrees of consciousness even within mankind, which are not irrelevant. Like he brings up the danger of the most conscious Europeans, whatever that means. So we may recall all the way back in Use and Abuse of History for Life, that essay where Nietzsche considers the relative serenity that we perceive in animals, or think we perceive. And he suggests that's because, from our point of view, the animal lives unhistorically. It's not placing itself within the stream of time as an individual proceeding from past to future. It's not troubled by its memories or burdened by fears of the future. So basically what we talked about before, of this temporal awareness forming the basis of self-consciousness. The overall theme of that essay is that Nietzsche is looking for some understanding of history that will, quote, quicken his activity, in the words of Goethe, that, all knowledge which does not enable or entice us to act is worthless. That was a thread of philosophical consideration for Nietzsche all the way back to The Birth of Tragedy, his first book. In Birth of Tragedy, he says that, what does he say? Quote, knowledge kills action, end quote. And that the wisdom of Hamlet is not, the cheap insight of Jack the Dreamer, who reflects too much and just can't figure out how to act, but rather Hamlet is an insight into the harmfulness of knowledge itself, the harmfulness of self-knowledge, of self-consciousness, the uncertainty of the future, the burden of mortality, and so on, to be or not to be. And that Hamlet is chained by the sorrow of deep knowledge. As Byron writes, quote, sorrow is knowledge. He who knows the most must mourn the deepest over the fatal truth, end quote. And so it's not necessarily that the point of the essay is that consciousness was a mistake. That would be too simplistic way to look at it. If we bring in some of Nietzsche's earlier writings and interpreting the passage, we can, I think, make the assertion that he believes, perhaps by learning to value such states of being once more, being unhistorical, by cultivating self-discipline or by properly educating ourselves into a more embodied, more complete view of ourselves. Put yourself into a supraconscious mind state, or what he calls a suprahistorical mind state. We can learn to recognize that all action requires, in some sense, that we suspend judgment. There are always doubts one can raise about the right course of action, but when it's time to act, in order to act at all, you have to be able to dismiss those thoughts and take action anyway. And so Nietzsche's pointing out the utility of non-consciousness, right? Of acting on impulse, getting in touch with your intuition, not being afraid of feelings or sensations that you can't communicate to others. But he's also, in some sense, providing us with an anthropological theory about consciousness and communication. But it's funny because ultimately it ends up being that the whole thrust of the passage is that he's shifting our perspective so that we regain a respect for that which we do, which is not communicable and which is not conscious, right? So, all right, let's keep going. We're almost at the end. Quote, "You will guess that it is not the opposition of subject and object that concerns me here. This distinction I leave to the epistemologists who have become entangled in the snares of grammar, the metaphysics of the people," end quote. I just want to stop here and say, calling grammar the metaphysics of the people, such a great, it's a great diss. The key to understanding how language impacts thought and how these laws of language are taken to be laws of reality. And these premises go unexamined in the minds of many, but you could say like that it's a democratic force on your very mind, the laws of grammar, which structure the thoughts in your head. All right, quote, "It is even less the opposition of thing in itself and appearance, for we do not know nearly enough to be entitled to such distinctions. We simply lack any organ for knowledge, for truth. We know, or believe, or imagine just as much as may be useful in the interests of the human herd. The species, and even what is here called utility, is ultimately also a mere belief, something imaginary, and perhaps precisely that most calamitous stupidity of which we shall perish one day," end quote. So he concludes by shoving off any attempt to interpret his words into some sort of metaphysical claim, explicitly rejecting the central metaphysical concerns of German idealism, lest his insights, here be subordinated into some sort of claim, or we can't know the true world, or language fails it from us. I mean, quite cleverly, he also shoots down Kant here by saying we have no organ for truth. We might remember, as Kant said, a faculty that allows us to know things about metaphysics, was his sort of explanation for synthetic knowledge a priori. Nietzsche says, I think it's by implication, there's no physiological basis for that. So he's not speaking metaphysically here. He'll leave that for others. Instead, he chooses to end with a warning that ultimately a concept that has underlain this entire inquiry is the concept of the utility for the herd, right? So here he puts utility in quotes, and no doubt he's taking his aim at the English utilitarian tradition, which we might presume, a utilitarian might simply hear out all of Nietzsche's concerns in this passage and merely blink, right? Superficial, the English utilitarian asks, and he blinks. Shallow, thin, herdish, but does it have utility? He asks, and he blinks. And so, we might well conclude that Nietzsche's concerns are perhaps rather reactionary or antiquated compared to our own values. Maybe we just simply have to embrace our nature as a collective species and embrace utility as a guiding value. The greatest good for the greatest many, because, in the full consciousness of what we're doing, we're still herd animals. And the temptation, I think, to conclude that way for many of us modern readers is why Nietzsche ends the passage the way he does. That even what we consider to be utility is merely an imagined value. What does that mean? That what may appear to have utility for in some sense, because utility can't just be reduced to physical pleasure and reduction of physical pain, right? We can get over that sort of silly oversimplification, right? Because we all should know at this point people are not simply just like pleasure-seeking machines. We have deeper psychological needs that can't be simply confined within the concept of pleasure or pain, right? And so there is, I guess to draw on the work of the libertarians and ANCAPs here, there is a subjective element to all value. There's a subjective value to things. It applies in economics just as much to the psychology. So what may appear to have value in the short term may have dire consequences in the long term. And Nietzsche begins the book arguing, to reiterate it, evil individuals have furthered the species just as much as good individuals, if not more so. And so what he predicts here is that utility itself something that we're conditioned by our linguistic restraints to see value in, may one day be the very thing responsible for our downfall, that we might perish of our pursuit of utility. So what does that mean? I mean, it could mean a great deal, but I think that, once again, the relevant metaphor is the last man, as I've already alluded to. The pursuit of utility may lead us to create societies which are increasingly safe, predictable, and comfortable. We may make our lives painfully easy. We might take away all struggle, challenge, and suffering. We may regulate and ban and pass laws until all that is dangerous and socially irresponsible will no longer be part of human life. And what will life be like then? Will we have been made stronger or weaker? And if it makes us weaker, if it makes us less able to adapt, if it makes us utterly dependent, if it makes us, just completely intellectual and abstracting creatures with less and less physical aptitude or competence, right? Then what then? Is not such a program anti-life? Is that not weakness? Is that not corruption? And so this is what I take from this passage of Nietzsche's, among the many, many other wonderful insights that he brings, that consciousness itself exists for the purposes of communication, which is, from an angle opposite Nietzsche's, a very beautiful and emancipatory view of the human condition, from one sense, that we came into self-awareness for the very purpose of seeking out one another and communing with one another, that things like love and artistic enjoyment, a meeting of two kindred spirits, that's the very point of our existence, and therefore that all must have an intrinsic value. But on the other hand, consciousness is dangerous by the same token, that we should not become too enamored with consciousness for all the power that it's bestowed. Rather, we should also learn to appreciate the power of those secret and hidden feelings, and that sometimes the thing that is within you but that you can't express might actually be a far better argument or a far better motivator for you than any of the contrived explanations that enter our consciousness. Okay, that was fun. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.